Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum that explores everything pertinent to digital trust. And I'm your host, Mathieu Claude. I've been starting to think more recently, just having been involved with different forms of digital identity, both on like personal identity and then organizational identity, seeing a lot less friction perhaps on the organizational identity side of things, whereas on personal, you end up having political concerns, privacy concerns. There's things that you maybe don't have on the organizational side of things, but at the same time, organizational identity is a very complex area in its own. So it may be worth going into some of the differences between both of those and maybe just discussing why organizational identity is perhaps more human than we think.
I like to kind of recount my SSI journey, and you're right. As you kind of go through how we've thought of SSI, and I think a lot of it comes from the personal desire to be able to have more agency and control over your own identity information, and so that I feel like that point of view helped to launch a lot of this ecosystem and the technologies that we use. But in a lot of ways, that kind of built on itself over time. And the more that we looked into ourselves and what personal identity is, the more we realized how complex our desires are. So just as you're saying, there's political concerns, privacy concerns, GDPR issues, and all these kinds of things that I think the SSI community and the technology stack related to it has had to take on, and it's a big undertaking. And often those stacks of technology and the way we implemented them, had limitations just from what we're capable of doing and what was already built, and but in a lot of ways there was a reasoning by analogy is the term that I like, because I like to think about things in terms of first principles construction and reasoning by analogy. So reasoning by analogy being let's think about the technologies that we currently have, when SSI really started to gain traction, cryptocurrency blockchains were a big thing. So, could we do a public permissionless implementation, and would that decentralization provide some new layer of security? And so I think that trying to leverage those technologies over time and improve upon them, and trying to think about the problem in terms of the personal needs that we have, has made the SSI solutions somewhat limited. Well, significantly limited, I guess. And so just from an organizational identity side, because it's a big problem to begin with, I think that building a stack based on the variety of organizations that can exist, on our planet, requires an approach that's more of first principles approach, that takes into account. I like that term, an identity stack and an implementation for identity that's more human, but also in a lot of ways it's more legal. It's more legal focused, because just to kind of take it to like a human level, families are an organizational unit, right? And they have dynamics to them that are complicated. But when families run into kind of legal situations, which is where a lot of our society is built, right? It's a weird dynamic. But organizations are very used to dealing with kind of the legal aspect, right? They start by, having to go through a legal process to be created, and then taxed and governed and regulated and all these kinds of things. And so I consider organizational identity to have two benefits that I think gives it advantage over kind of the original genesis of kind of SSI technologies. That it is a big enough problem that you're forced into that first principles solution, which we'll unpack over time, I think. But also at the same time, you have a framework for how business is done. And that includes legal aspects, and the legal frameworking provides some restrictions that allow you to actually produce a solution that I think is really valuable, and can possibly be the actual seed for SSI to expand. And so the idea that you have to build from first principles and the limitations of kind of the legal frameworking that organizations have to work within seems to be something special.
Whereas on personal identity, we hear about data privacy or data protection laws when it comes to consumers, like GDPR as an example, which, like, honestly, if we look at the ways that organizations have implemented controls, or at least put in place implementations to ensure that they adhere to GDPR, we're in an environment where it's just every day we're clicking checkboxes online without reading whatever is underneath that, and that's been kind of the response to GDPR. So you did talk a little bit about different types of legal requirements. Like I think an organization is a legal structure to begin with different rules baked into governance of that organization. So ultimately, a legal entity is governed and managed by individuals, and so at the same time that you don't have those same, like, privacy concerns or political concerns within an organization. Like, an organization's a public entity and maybe they don't have the same privacy needs that just an individual has, but they're still meshed with individuals that are delegated different tasks or different jobs. Does that additional delegation just add to the complexity of what organizational ID means? And then I guess organizational ID is probably a pretty broad term as well, right? So we could be talking
Yeah,
about so many different types of claims or attestations.
touched on something really important there that I probably should have mentioned earlier, is that a lot of times when we thought about personal identity, we thought in terms of your public self and your private self, and how to manage that. And so that's part of uh, the difficulty of creating, again, the technology stack plus the, dealing with just the different points of view. But yeah, public facing identity that we have within organizations is probably an easier starting point for identity. And so just to kind of frame organizational identity in terms of my work, so I am a software developer for GLEIF, and that's a global organization. It's the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, and they were created as a response to the 2008 financial crisis. And in the 2008 financial crisis, essentially, one of the most important lessons learned was that there are banks that own banks that own banks, and how, as a regulator, or how do we as a society gauge the risk that a single bank has, right? These are pillars essentially to our financial industry. But if a bank is exposed to a particular set of risks, real estate type risks, and then that bank also owns multiple other banks that have exposed themselves in the same way to that risk, then it if you're not aware of the hierarchy of those banks, and who owns them, and who is responsible, who are the officers of that bank, who are the representatives of that bank, it becomes very hard to gauge kind of the fragility of your financial system. So organizational identity, especially legal identities, that's what I've been focused on. That's what GLEIF is focused on. And that in that case, you want transparency, and so you want these identifiers, the identities associated with this, both for the companies and the individuals. You want that to be as transparent as possible, so that you can properly regulate and gauge risk. And so I think that's another aspect that just makes organizational identity a really great starting point. And yeah, societally, our governments, and financial institutions, and pretty much everything that we've done, we've set up from a legal framework of these legal entities. And there are still privacy aspects, absolutely, and there once again requires this first principles approach in order to kind of take on the task of even just being able to craft the identities in a way that this kind of takes it back to the human. It needs to have the mechanisms necessary to make it so that there's not a single representative of a bank, right? The CEO will say, and since we're talking about SSI and cryptography, the CEO, is going to make cryptographic signatures for particular contracts or something like that. But you don't want the CEO or just the representatives for the company alone to have to do all the heavy lifting for the company to be able to do anything, right? You want there to be some form of delegation within that company. And so you have to be able to produce these hierarchies of identifiers and credentials that allow these companies to essentially express themselves exactly as they've been crafted, especially in legal documents, but then also in terms of their employees and who reports to who. Yeah, the kind of identity stack and governance framework need to be able to support those operations for these companies. And so tackling that from like a public standpoint, where, just let's say from a regulator's point of view, if you're a bank regulator, then yeah, you want to be able to understand when you receive, let's say, a financial report, you'll want to be able to trace where that information came from, right? Is it authentic from that company? And then kind of what is the delegation of authority for the different signatures, right? Because maybe the CEO makes a statement of the whole summary, but at the same time, the CFO is making financial statements about the company, and then other representatives are making statements, related to the operations, let's say, of that company, so on and so forth. So it requires quite a bit of effort, especially in the initial implementation of the stack. So a technological stack, that's first principle, and then also the governance stack. I haven't mentioned that much, but essentially the GLEIF has created both a technical stack and a governance stack. And those things married together are what really gives identity seeds the organizational identity ecosystem. And that's kind of another thing that, when I was first learning about SSI technologies, often people talk about these technological stacks and different features and things like that. And I'm very passionate about those things. I'm a software developer, but without a governance stack tied to it, it gets complicated really fast about what do you trust, and who can you trust? How do you, from a grassroots level, let's say, generate reputation, essentially. And so I think that coming at it from, again, organizational identity really helps to kind of seed an ecosystem with reputation and trust, which we can talk about more.
Yeah, and since you talked about GLEIF a little bit, I did do a podcast. It's probably a couple of years ago. I'll have to find the episode with Carla McKenna from uh, the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation. But it may be worth just talking a little bit, especially that you're bringing in governance in now as well, just to talk from the perspective of GLEIF and legal identity identifiers, and maybe within the context of a use case, which is makes things a little bit easier to understand. And we could probably understand how you start from governance and a root of trust and how chaining and delegation happens all the way down through organizations to employees to their roles and so forth. And so there's one example you had been talking to me about with the EU banking authority and kind of the, as you mentioned, the genesis of GLEIF being after the financial crisis in 2008. So can you talk a little bit about what organizational identity looks like from the perspective of GLEIF, organizations that they're working with that are regulated under the EU banking authority, and then just the benefits, I guess, that as a relying party, the EU banking authority gets from this reputation or this trust?
Just to kind of do a quick history. So essentially the G20 helped to stand up GLEIF. And if you were going to stand up an organization like that needs to be kind of a genesis, if you will, for some identifiers for companies all across the globe. Well, starting a nonprofit that's in Switzerland and that's kind of globally distributed with offices all over the world is a good place to start. It's GLEIF itself is heavily regulated by the board. It's called the ROC, which has representatives again that are all across the globe. A lot of them come from kind of a financial background because again, if you were going to create something like this, well, having a strong use case like the 2008 financial crisis is a good way to have a targeted focus on the problem you need to solve. So since kind of GLEIF has been stood up, there's been 2.4 million legal entity identifiers, so LEIs. I loved, by the way, the episode that you did with Carla McKenna from GLEIF. Just fantastic about the governance framework. And so those LEIs, 2.4 million LEIs, include companies like Chase Bank, but also companies like Coca-Cola. And so it's quite an adoption. There's regulators that essentially all over the globe who essentially when a company, is involved in the financial system or in other industries, that the LEI as a ISO standard is mandated that they receive an LEI, and so they go through a process, a bit of a KYC process where they have to submit their documents and things like that, and they receive this identifier. And you can go onto gleif.org and essentially look up which companies have LEIs. But so that is a non-cryptographic identifier, right? It's similar to any other identifier that we've written down on paper and shown somebody in order to do the transactions in life that we need to do. But the vLEI is essentially the SSI cryptographic identifier stack, the decentralized identity stack for that correlates to these LEIs. And so with the vLEI, you are given, well, you create actually your company and the representatives create an identifier that is a cryptographic identifier that's bound to public and private keys, and we can kind of go into more of that. But the point is, what you're trying to do is seed a system that can leverage essentially the concept of the LEI, the ability to trace organizations by an identifier and know who the representatives are, but now do it digitally and do it in a way that's cryptographically verifiable, and not just cryptographically verifiable in an instant. Right? It's not just, are you and I having this conversation now? Can we trade, cryptographic material in a way that makes us feel like this conversation that we're having is secure? right? But instead, for me to be able to make an important statement about a company that I work for, or submit a regulatory report or something like that, and have that over time be able to exist beyond the moment that it was submitted, right? To have that regulatory report or artifact exist, long before a CEO steps, long after a CEO steps down, or something like that. So, this is the problem that essentially, we've been trying to solve at various levels in the SSI community for a long time. But because of the governance framework that GLEIF has defined, and shout out to Trust over IP, who help to essentially provide the scaffolding, if you will, for creating governance frameworks within the SSI world, and then GLEIF's implementation of that for legal entities specifically is to my knowledge, the most successful and kind of complete implementation of that trust over IP scaffolding for a governance framework. And so what that governance framework is defining for the vLEI system is essentially what are all the roles, and how does this seeding of trust begin. And so back with LEIs, you essentially had in the governance framework for LEIs, it said that there was something called LOUs. The idea of an LOU is that all across the globe, you would spread out kind of the ability for an LEI to be granted across these LOUs. The LOUs would do the actual work for doing the KYC verification process. And so in vLEIs, there's a similar concept. Even though GLEIF is the root of trust for a vLEI credential, they don't actually issue any of those credentials. They're not they essentially issue QVIs. QVIs are qualified vLEI issuers. They see that ability to QVIs, and then QVIs can be spread across the globe and provide the issuance of this digital credential for these companies. And so that is the beginnings and of the seeding of the kind of the cryptographic portion of the vLEI ecosystem. So now, if you have essentially GLEIF as the root of trust for vLEIs, and then you have QVIs issuing these, now companies are coming with their LEIs. There's 2.4 million of them now, and more all the time. They can come with their LEI, go through another kind of KYC process that's specific to kind of creating this cryptographic relationship, and they can receive essentially the credentials necessary for the representatives. So the OORs of a company, those are the organizational representatives, the official organizational representatives.
OOR stands for official organizational role. So OOR persons who represent legal entities in official roles.
And then the QVIs or the companies, depending on how the relationship gets set up and the technical abilities of the company, then ECRs.
ECR stands for engagement context role. So ECR persons who represent legal entities in functional roles.
Are a type of credential that's given, that's essentially a delegation of authority to what you can effectively think of as an employee, right? As an employee comes onboards onto the company, they receive a credential that's allows them to execute a particular task. So that's kind of the tracing down to now what you're talking about is a regulator. Okay. And a regulator has a decision, right? If you, in this case, GLEIF just completed a proof of concept with the EBA, which is the European Banking Authority, and tough task, right? For the EBA in the sense that they have to regulate banks across the EU, and so that's across multiple countries. And they going to create essentially the account system for those banks to be able to submit regulatory documents to them in order for them to regulate them and have kind of a legal artifact that's tying what the bank says that they are doing and their hierarchy to a document that they submit. And so in a traditional IT system, yeah, the EBA would have stood up an account system that every bank would come in and have to register, and you would have to kind of go through the growing pains of, oh, there's this special case for this bank and for this bank, and so we need to change our system that way. And right, it would be this very arduous process of trying to create the centralized system. And not only is it arduous, as we know, with the internet and any centralized service, this becomes an attack vector, right? And that now the EBA is responsible for. I don't know about you, Mathieu, but I've had multiple government or other types of accounts that I've been notified over time. There's been a compromise. Your information's out there. Here, these are some things that you can do, and yeah, it's very frustrating, right? And so an organization like EBA can make a choice if they're going to try to set up that and go through that process, and it's just a massive investment from their side, or they can choose to leverage the vLEI system. And how would that work? Well, if every bank has an LEI, which they do in the European Union, then they can all get vLEIs, which now gives them their cryptographic identifiers and capabilities. Then they can express their bank in terms of their representatives and the employees that they need in order to comply with regulatory oversight. And so using the vLEI system and these OR credentials and the ECR credentials, you can now essentially construct this reporting, this entire reporting chain that will result in someone, and in this case we'll say they have the document submitter role for their company. That person with the document submitter role will essentially collect all the information. Hopefully that information is signed information. There's rules about kind of what needs to be signed in that report, and assuming the signatures in that report are valid, and assuming that the employee who actually submits to the EBA this report, assuming that that's valid, a valid submission because they have a valid ECR credential that says that they are the EBA document submitter for a bank in the European Union, that is pretty much the only thing that the bank is going to have to verify. They only have to set up enough of an IT system to securely accept this credential. I'm sorry, this report and the credential. So they have to verify the credential of the submitter and then verify that the report has the proper signatures. And you've just created essentially it could even be global, but we'll say a continental reporting system that is end-to-end verifiable cryptographically. And so if ever there's an error in, a statement in that report, which could just be by mistake or maybe intentional, you don't know, but over time you can trace back through that entire supply chain, if you will, for a report, and then kind of discover where the mistake was made and with who, and so you would know who to go to.
Well, all of this really comes from a solid root of trust and governance, but it's all about just integrity of signatures. And it seems like a lot of the problems that exist today on the internet within organizations when fraud happens, cybersecurity attacks, all somewhat have to do with the integrity of signatures. And so if we take all of what you just walked us through here and we look at the way that authentication is done today, I think over the past couple of years, we've seen more widespread adoption of multi-factor authentication being used by different companies, which is great. But multi-factor authentication today is designed to identify devices and not necessarily identities. It's not bound to an identity or a signature. It's just more bound to a device. So it has gaps there. And I do believe if we always come back to big headline cybersecurity attacks, as we're talking today, just over the past month or so, there was a big attack on MGM, the big gaming company, through Okta servers, where I guess hackers took advantage of some vulnerabilities with highly privileged users and being able to take advantage of turning off multi-factor authentication uses. But so it may be interesting just to look through another example here. We talked about the EBA, the EU Banking Authority, and how something like signatures with integrity and all of the other pieces could bring trust and security and so forth. Let's talk about another example and just looking at this recent MGM Okta attack. And it would be great if you could just walk through how this attack happened, and then again, how through these new mechanisms that we're talking about here with high integrity signatures wrapped with governance, that we could have resolved or prevented this issue from happening altogether.
Yeah, that it really brings up it highlights the difference between an administrative root of trust and a cryptographic root of trust. Essentially, what we've been dealing with on the internet in terms of accounts, and like you said, it's a lot of the accounts don't necessarily identify or not very good at identifying a person. Instead, machines and things like that. Essentially, the internet stack skipped the identity step, right? And there, it's not like that wasn't discussed all throughout the end of the 80s and the 90s. But what we ended up with is a mechanism for moving information across a network, which has been amazing, right, for us. But it's also been a security nightmare, and we've tried very hard to create essentially these administrative roots of trust. So PKI works this way, right? There's a certificate authority and the administrators for that. You have administrators for the actual domain that you're controlling, and the servers related to it. Big tech has created accounts for us that essentially are centralized, and that obviously creates issues as well, even though somebody like a Google is fully capable of scaling globally. They've shown that, right? There's political issues with that, administrative issues, but the biggest thing in this case we're talking about is the attack surface area, right? What is the hardest mechanism? What is the easiest attack that hackers can leverage in order to gain trusted access to a system? And so what these centralized kind of administrative roots of trust do is they create this fortress. And it's a big fortress with long walls, if you will, and the security mechanisms in terms of kind of the classic movie hacker who's got their command line prompt up and they're moving through different tunneling mechanisms and taking advantage of different IT infrastructure. The truth is, a lot of times that's not how it goes, right? Usually, if it's an administrative root of trust, you attack at the person level. people tend to be more vulnerable in these kind of systems. And so social engineering is a much easier attack than any, brute force computing attack, which, which are probably less and less effective, at least until, post-quantum type computers are created. So you attack essentially the people. You try to find a way to gain access to an account that has enough privilege in order to get inside the system. And once you're inside the system, it's essentially a honeypot, right? And so that's why often, like I said, over time, I've gotten these letters from different, governing bodies or large companies or whatever who have had an attack, and they send me a letter and, oh, how far did the attack go? Well, it was thousands or hundreds of thousands, or, depending on the size of the thing, maybe millions of users. And so the MGM, Okta attack is just another instance where you have this massive organization that is now losing millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, over weeks, right? It doesn't take that long to lose a lot of money, in those systems. And how did it happen? An administrative account was attacked, and that's it. You've got enough access to then I think Caesars paid $15 million to essentially get back their data that was essentially stolen and ransomwared. And so yeah, it's a much different world in the cryptographic root of trust world, right? Where the vLEI exists. Instead of these massive honeypots, what you're trying to, because you're decentralizing the identifiers to individuals and to companies and things like that, that begins to distribute some of the danger. And the surface area for these things are points all over the globe instead of, this centralized thing. But that doesn't mean that, an account can't still be compromised. I mean, it definitely will be, right? So if we were designing first principles systems, we assume that over time, every account, the strength of its security and the possibility of compromise, is growing with time. And so we have to take that into account. So what are some of the mechanisms that we can use? Well, when I said that you create a company identifier in order to get a vLEI for your company, most companies, the Coca-Colas and the Chases, they have multiple representatives, right? And so you wouldn't want to make it so that a single representative in that company, if you gain access to their account, it's over. You've been owned, and now this company is doing all kinds of things that it's not intending to do because one of the identifiers has been cryptographically compromised. Instead, you create multi-sig identifiers. And not only just multi-sig meaning that there's multiple signatures required in order for that identifier to execute an action. Not only is it multi-sig requiring these identifiers to agree, but you can specify things like, okay, for a valid action to occur, I need 3 of 5 of the signatures. So, there's 5 representatives for this company, and they've all got their own identifiers that have their own ability to do cryptographic signatures. You need 3 of the 5. So now you've just made it so that, an attacker has to compromise at least 3 of those accounts. So they have to locate who they are. They have to do all of the social engineering or whatever other types of attacks that they're going to try to do. And it has to be kind of done, all at one time, right? It has to be like this rush attack, because if one of those accounts is compromised and it's detected that account is compromised, what are you going to do? You're going to recover from that compromise, and we can talk about those mechanisms after this. But yeah, essentially now you have a much higher barrier of entry as an attacker in order to compromise the corporate account or some other account that is important. The bottom line is that every account that a person uses within the vLEI ecosystem or a company uses should have multi-sig set up. So if I'm a single person that has my identifier and I have a role within the company, I'm an employee, I'm a software developer for GLEIF, and so that gives me certain privileges within GLEIF. Even I will set up a multi-sig. So I'll have my identifier actually be tied to multiple devices, right? It'll be my mobile phone, it'll be my laptop, it'll be, I may have a paper identifier that's secured, by some, paper cryptographic credential, something like that, where now in order to hack my singular account, you also have to hack more than one of my devices, because I'll set up a multi-sig. Let's say it's 2 of 3. And so it's kind of this multi-factor thing that we're accustomed to, and it's cryptographic, so I can use things like a hardware security module as well. My phone has obviously a trusted enclave portion to it. So yeah, you get some flexibility to create multi-sig in your individual accounts, and then imagine if all these individual accounts are multi-sig, and then the corporate accounts are also multi-sig. Okay, so now you have to hack multiple devices for multiple individuals, and then hack multiple individuals, compromise them in order to gain access, to, let's say, a corporate account. And so now the attack surface is completely unmanageable. I'm not aware of any multi-sig compromise, on the planet. Now, part of that is there's just not many that exist, so hopefully that's going to change in a big way over the next few years using the vLEI ecosystem. But yeah, it's all about essentially making it so that an attacker just isn't going to spend the time, and making it so that even if they compromise something, it has so little return, just that singular thing, that yeah, they're not going to spend the time, trying on multiple devices. With all that being said, yeah, we can talk more about kind of the other security mechanisms related to those things, but just the concept alone of multi-sig, and really delegation of authority is so delegation is kind of a separate concept. In the vLEI ecosystem, there's the ability to actually have to do a delegation to a specific identifier in order for it to act on your behalf in certain ways. So that's between identifiers, but more commonly, delegation of authority via like a credential that I can revoke as a company. So I have an employee, let's say they are the document submitter for EBA for submitting our reports. Well, when that employee moves on, I can then revoke that credential. And, that's more common in the SSI world. I think that we've seen that kind of use case. And, that's also an extremely effective way to, be able to manage kind of this hierarchy of security that is agile enough to kind of adapt over time, but also create just a high barrier of entry for any attacker.
Yeah, so definitely agree that most attacks nowadays happen via social engineering. The weak point is the human in there that controls the username and the password, or is able to do a permission change and so forth. And I do agree that if it's too difficult, people are too lazy to. If you just add that one barrier on top of it with multi-factor authentication or signatures via crypto roots of trust versus admin accounts, you're just going to significantly increase the barriers and reduce the attack vectors. One of the other security mechanisms that maybe is worth talking about is the rotation of keys. And there's a lot of areas where this doesn't happen today. I think one security mechanism that organizations put in place is just changing your password every 30 days or on a specific cadence. So there is the idea of rotation, but how do we distinguish between that type of rotation versus rotating keys under perhaps a public or a private identifier? How is that done? And of course, there's a lot of areas where that's not done today. Like one easy one I could think of is just like if I have a crypto account or address on a specific blockchain, like there's no ability to ever rotate keys, which definitely creates big security risks and attack vectors there. So we talked about multi-sig, the power of that. Maybe worth diving a little bit deeper into the rotation of keys and why that is so important and why it's maybe not that hard to put into place.
Yeah, this so the vLEI stack, the technological stack, is based on KERI, KERI, which stands for Key Event Receipt Infrastructure. And this kind of goes back to the first principles approach. I don't know about you, but over time, as I kind of learned about the SSI ecosystem and the different things, two things that were often kind of hand waved. There's support here and there, but often it's neglected, which is the ability to rotate and the implications of what a rotation has for credentials and any signatures that exist out in the wild over time. And revocation itself, I think, often we know we need it, but being able to scale revocation and how do you design a system to be to handle revocation, and what are the implications when something's revoked? I've found that these are kind of the areas that are often well, it gets complicated fast, I guess, is one way to put it. So what is one of the like novel features of KERI that has really helped it to serve this role? If you assume that any account over time is becoming weaker because every time you have to even just pull your key information into memory in order to use it, there's potential, right? You're increasing your attack surface, but yeah, every time you have to use your keys, essentially your cryptographic keys, you're essentially creating opportunity for attack. And so over time, essentially there's a degradation of those keys. I think you did say something about 30 days, and it reminded me that the guidance for X509 certificates, the guidance is that the keys related to your X509 infrastructure should be rotated every 30 days. Well, how many organizations do we know that are actually listening to that guidance? And so you need this ability to go from this is my public and private key, right? My asymmetric key pair. I need to be able to move from this to another one. And so pre-rotation is the term that's used, that I essentially believe that KERI has made kind of famous. And that's that when you create your identifier, you actually have created it with public private key pairs for your current key state, but you've also committed to a future key state, a public private key pair. And so that's called pre-rotation, because you're essentially setting up your ability to rotate in the future. And so why is that important? It's important because if you ever detect that your account has been compromised, right? Somehow you've lost control of your identifier. You need a way to be able to say, okay, my secret that I currently have, but you don't know the next secret that I committed to. And so you can rotate essentially to those new keys. And by the way, when you rotate, you have to you are now exposing the public key of your pre-rotated future keys. That becomes your current key state, and you have to now commit to a new future set of keys. And in multi-sig, obviously that could be multiple pairs of public-private key pairs. And I think it's important to note that let's take again, let's say we're doing first principles identity, right? And that requires these cryptographic mechanisms for overcoming this compromise. Well, people talk about post-quantum secure, right? How can you be post-quantum secure if all the key pairs that we're creating right now are secure until quantum computers come online? What happens after that, right? And so the commitment that you make to your future key pairs in KERI with pre-rotation, that commitment doesn't expose the public key. It actually is a digest, a hash of that future public key. And it turns out that a digest of a public key is post-quantum secure. So that's fascinating, right? That even though the public key itself, that's the result of that digest, even though that public key itself isn't post-quantum secure, the commitment to it is post-quantum secure. So this is now you've essentially baked post-quantum security into your key management mechanism. Now, of course, if tomorrow we found out that there's all of these quantum computers that are out there breaking everything, you would have to rotate. If let's say you're doing your vLEI, you would have to rotate to that new key. Of course, that new key is not doesn't have the strength to withstand the post quantum, but you would immediately do another rotation so that you're now using a key pair that is post quantum secure, and of course your commitment was always to your future keys is also post quantum secure. So not to talk about the post quantum side so much, but the point is that pre-rotation is the mechanism for allowing an identifier to become a persistent identifier. So I had said it earlier that we want these identifiers for a company to long outlast the representatives, right? Coca-Cola, how long has that company been around? And how long will it be in the future? Probably a long time. And so CEOs will come and go, employees will come and go. But the ability for the identifier for that organization of Coca-Cola, you want that to be able to persist over time. So you have to build this key management structure that essentially uses key events that are all chained together. And so KERI, KERI, the key event is it's a log, if you will, or you can even think of it as it's a micro blockchain. It's a micro ledger for your identifier, the key state of your identifier. And so that's where cryptographic trust starts, is the ability to start cryptographically, but then over time to manage an identifier's cryptographic key state so that you can go as far into the future as you need. So these persistent identifiers, this concept is core to KERI. KERI was designed to solve this problem. And so that's hopefully ties back to kind of when I'm saying first principles identity, it's not just the idea that, we can use a asymmetric key pair and then associate with an identifier, and so we're good to go. We can start doing these cryptographic operations. There's much more to it than that, because you need a history, and within that history, to take it back to signatures now, let's use the EBA proof of concept. The European Banking Authority, they received this report. It has a bunch of signatures in it. Well, if let's say the CEO is one of the signers of that report, let's say they signed it 3 rotations ago. How do you know that that signature is valid or not? If you don't have a log of the key events that helps you to trace the history of these things, then you don't really know, right? That if the CEO's account, let's say, was compromised, their key was compromised somehow, and they had to rotate, or they just chose to rotate at some time, and possibly an attacker could have attacked their cryptographic keys, and it be discovered and they rotated, or perhaps over time an attacker figured out an old key because the public key was out there, and somehow they've compromised an old key. Well, the signature was that signature from the CEO at the time, or was it, is it some compromised key? And so looking at the key event log of an identifier allows you to essentially know that at the time of signature, that was the key state for that identifier, and that identifier is tied to the CEO, and therefore it is a valid CEO signature, even though the key state has changed over time. Hopefully that wasn't too techie, but it really this concept of pre-rotation is massively important, and we're starting to see many other SSI stacks adopting it because it's this is going to be, and is at this point, but it will be pervasive across the SSI community over time.
So we've been quite heavily focused on security features so far today, and these being able to prevent different problems like this MGM Mokta hack from happening, and a bunch of others. And I assume, if I was actually at a cybersecurity conference last week, if you walk into there and you look at all the vendors in the space that are providing patch solutions, I guess, to different problems, until some of these core first principle based security items that we're talking about are solved, it's going to be difficult to prevent attacks from happening. And with the advent of things like generative AI, it's becoming just cheaper and cheaper to conduct cybersecurity attacks alongside all sorts of other things. We've talked about security. It's worth maybe talking about the user experience for a second, because at the end of the day, it's not always the best security product or the best performing product altogether that gets adoption. It often comes to just the ease of use. It often comes to knowing where the market is at, knowing what the current user experience is, not necessarily changing people's habits too drastically, or else it becomes very difficult to gain adoption. So maybe one thing, talking about just within an organization and organization implementing a policy, it could be another UX story altogether if we're just talking about general consumer use of these things. But how important is just user experience and design in this whole context of obviously security being the top thing that we need to be thinking about? But how important is user experience, and how confident are you with all of these improvements of security features that they could be implemented within solutions pretty easily and will make it appealing for people to use?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I do think that some of the elements are a little bit surprising. So we talked about multi-sig, and that probably feels, to anyone who hasn't really considered it, it probably feels daunting. But in fact, multi-sig is, allows you to kind of introduce your devices into the process, and like we've talked about, there's multi-factor authentication that people are used to. So in some ways, I do think that some of these elements make the user experience easier. But you are right that in terms of cryptographic things, the identifiers in the vLEI ecosystem in KERI, they are cryptographic identifiers, and you look at them and it just can be overwhelming. So I would say that UX for sure has to find smart ways of kind of working around that. And we've just as an internet community who's uses browsers and UIs, obviously database tables and identifiers within databases and indexes and all these kinds of things. Well, that's not an impossible problem to solve, but the management of these things is another reason that I think that SSI growing up from like a personal identifier is very hard, because you're putting quite a burden on somebody who, had various reasons for why they wanted their own, to be able to control their identity. But in a corporate environment, there's at least a higher threshold for at least doing some identifier slash key management. It still requires UX that's excellent. I've given multiple talks on various SSI topics. The most recent one was secure organizational identity, which was at IAW, and it was great to see you there. That was the 37th, I think, Internet Identity Workshop, and just an incredible unconference, right? So it's just this incredible conference of ideas being traded and about identity and implementations and things like that. But yeah, in that secure organizational identity talk, our first three bullet points for that are most important for a secure organizational identity is security, security, security. Ironically, and I hadn't even thought about this at the time, but I had attended a talk by Drummond Reed from Trust Over IP. He can be thought of as one of the godfathers. You've had him, on here on SSI Orbit multiple times, I think. And, he said that for adoption of SSI technologies, the, three most important things were UX, UX, UX. And I parroted that in some slides and a presentation that I did after that. So it's ironic that I fully feel that that tension between the two, security, 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 and UX, UX, UX. It's just going to require more time spent on it. I do believe that like I said, there is some analogy to databases and indexes and things like that, but it'll be really important for, if you're the EBA document submitter, for it to just look like a website to you, that you are you can see the status of a report and the signatures that are on there and the signatures that are still needed. And then for you to be able to yourself sign that report, and then for you to be able to upload it to the EBA, so that they, can give you a check mark that says we've received your report and, your regulatory status is, currently compliant, right? So kind of that human workflow is going to be really important. And you did note, that crypto accounts, right? A lot of people have done kind of cryptocurrency stuff, but not so much, in the non-technical community. And so, yeah, those I hadn't really talked about it much during the pre-rotation stuff, but those were cryptographic identifiers, and so there's some, these Chrome extensions and things like that help people to kind of manage a cryptographic identifier. We need essentially the same things within the SSI community, but instead of kind of looking to see how much of your fungible tokens you have, that's like the cryptocurrency world, right? In the identity world, you need to be able to manage your key state, be able to rotate your keys. If it's multi-sig, which it should be, you need a good UX that's helping you to know that, in order for us to do this rotation, we've got to go through the kind of, I'll call it multi-factor authentication, but you need to collect the multiple signatures. And so, yeah, we need effective UXs that kind of help you to know the status, similar to kind of the status of the signing of a report. You need to know the status of your key state, and the meeting the threshold for being able to execute a transaction or a rotation or something like that. So for most normal users, we need to hide those cryptographic elements as much as possible so that to them it feels important, but not overwhelming.
And it's probably worth differentiating UX from a just consumer individual standpoint from an organizational standpoint. Like it's probably not that it's an easy thing to do, but you could implement the process and train staff on using something and have regular refreshers and audits and stuff like that. Whereas on the personal side of things, adoption is not driven the same way. Like your organization will have a business process they want to put into place because there's a clear business case there versus with an end consumer. And if we think about that, a SPAC acronym, security, privacy, authenticity, and confidentiality, I think for organizations, we've been obviously talking about security being number one. You said security, security, security. I'd say probably authenticity is there as well versus we often hear on the consumer side about privacy and confidentiality, but at the same time, until like good good enough user experiences are created or I don't know what, it's going to be tough to change consumer behavior, especially when people talk about privacy and confidentiality, but surveys show that general people don't really care that much about it. They're still willing to use products that make their lives easier, even though there may be gaps there as well. So if I take it back to how we opened up the conversation saying, do we think organizational ID is easier to implement than personal ID, or will it see adoption quicker? There's probably still some challenges to overcome, and we talked about UX, but it seems like it's a easier path to implementation than the complex environment of personal identities. Is I
Yeah, I
guess
agree.
where I'm getting to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, it just the way that humans in a personal context approach, a task, especially, the official tasks in their life, it's just way different than when you're getting paid by a company and yeah, they're providing training and they have the resources to kind of stand up a context specific way of executing the actions, right? I think probably it would be a mistake to to think that we even within the vLEI ecosystem that we could come up with a generic user experience for all things related to keys and signatures and things like that. Certainly there'll be some core kind of components to build off of, but one of the really important parts of the vLEI ecosystem is that because it has a legal entity framework to it, use case to it, that the idea of contracts in the disclosure of information and in the transactions for companies is extremely important. So again, if you were building a first principles identity stack, if that identity stack doesn't include the ability to kind of introduce the contractual portions of life, especially for organizational identity, then there's something lacking there. So this is another, I feel like, important portion of the vLEI ecosystem that in IPEX, so the issuance, presentation, exchange of verifiable credentials in the vLEI ecosystem, it's often referred to as graduated disclosure. And so that kind of sounds like, if you're an SSI person, like selective disclosure, but there's some nuance to it, and so it's got a slightly different name, which by the way happens often in the kind of KERI stack. I think a little side tangent is that sometimes people who are from other SSI technology stacks, and they start to see these new terms that sound similar or and related to terms that they know. So in this case, graduated disclosure versus like selective disclosure. Well, the truth is selective disclosure, in the vLEI ecosystem is just a portion of graduated disclosure. But kind of one of the big elements is, Mathieu, if you and I are doing an exchange with each other, the truth is we only want to exchange the minimum amount of data to each other in order for us to move on to the next step, whatever that next step may be. So you say something like, okay, are you a legal entity? And so maybe I provide my legal entity identifier. But then now that you know that I'm a legal entity, let's say that you're well, let's just say that you're the EBA, are you a regulated, legal entity, and now I disclose some information about, let's say I'm a bank or something like that. But in that process, because you had mentioned SPAC and privacy, and so, it triggered this thought, Dr. Sam Smith, who's the creator of KERI at IAW, which we were both just at, he gave some talks about privacy, and I don't want to get too much into that portion of it just because of time. But the truth is that the way that we protect companies and individuals is through contracts. It's contractually protected mechanisms, right? But we also use things like encryption and things like that, so that we can remain confidential, and signatures, and with key event logs and all these things for authenticity. But with legal entities, every transaction essentially ends up being a contractually protected interaction, right? Companies do NDAs with each other and all these kinds of things. So that's actually built into the exchange for the vLEI ecosystem, is this ability to do these graduated disclosures. They don't always endeavor to provide non-correlating information, but instead that is an element for like the selective disclosure part of gradual disclosure. But as we're interacting, we should be able to kind of step up our relationship in terms of the terms and contracts that are in place in order to divulge information. And the truth is, whether it's personal identity or organizational identity, once you give someone information, it's like they have control over the fact that they've seen that information. But if you can tie contracts to the disclosure of that information, then now at least there is a legal mechanism that if that information is misused, that you have legal recourse. And even in personal identity, this is effective in the sense that companies can generally afford to do legal action with each other, but individuals, it's much harder. But in most places, there's the idea that many individuals can bundle together to affect a legal action on, let's say, a company that might be misusing their data or something like that. And so this idea of tying contracts throughout the process of exchanging information between companies and individuals is another first principles just important element of the vLEI ecosystem, and a lot of times it's kind of this step-by-step process where it's like, okay, if this information is enough and we validated it and we want to move on, well, now we can, instead of presenting you with this massive contract from the beginning and you have no idea if the two of you are ever even going to go through the full process needed for that contract, to be able to kind of do it in a gradual way, right? Gradually protected disclosure, I think is really important.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed these conversations as much as I do. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice to make sure you're notified of new episodes that may be of interest to you. If you're looking to connect, feel free to reach out directly to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Catch you all later.